proceed. This Friday, I'm moving on into a whole other domain of what has been a set of very precious preoccupations for me. After many, many, many lectures, I worked our way, myself, my listeners, and anybody else who's tuning into us. I worked my way through the application of lifespan developmental theory, both individual lifespan developmental theory and family lifespan developmental theory, the implications for that body of understanding and about people, its relevance for what we do in the consulting room if we're trying to help people whose lives feel trouble to them. I'm now going to move on to another topic entirely. I touched on it last time when I was finishing. I had originally labeled it as the use of intuition in psychotherapy. As I spent the week since I made that announcement, I thought that's not really a good title. Intuition really refers to something that's strange, out of consciousness, mysterious, spiritual. I don't know. It has all kinds of extra connotations. And I don't think that's what I want to refer to. I remembered a nice quote from Freud when asked about how one does the psychoanalytic method. He said that the analyst should listen with what he called free floating attention. And that stuck with me. And I think what I'm trying to talk about comes very close to what I believe he was experiencing too. It's that you don't try and do and what's being said to you, or you don't set goals about what you're going to remember and what you're going to pay attention to. You don't have a conversation with yourself about how you're supposed to manage what's happening in the consulting room, because all of that means you're not listening anymore and you're not with the client anymore. What you do is you surrender to the flow that's taking place between the two of you. You don't have to listen to every word. You can trust yourself to get preoccupied with something, or notice a vase on your desk at that moment, whatever. Just go with what's happening to you. Don't try to control it. And I believe there's not a mystical experience happening. There is a very special experience that takes place. It's the same one that takes place between mothers and infants. There is an attunement that happens. If we can just be there listening with free floating attention, we're being influenced by the client. We're being influenced by tone of voice, by gestural communication, by small breaks in the narrative and interruptions and changes of subject and whatever is happening, it's affecting us. We are resonating to it. And inside ourselves, we're giving birth to all kinds of imagery. So I think I'm going to call what I'm talking about learning to pay attention to attunement. That's what I'm going to call it, because an attunement is happening. We are adjusting to the client and the client is adjusting to us. And part of what's happening inside of us is a result of that interplay that's taking place that we might not even be noticing or commenting on to ourselves. So now let me do some screen sharing. And I hope I can do it without screwing it up. I will get there. This has to be closed. Here it is. Here's what I experience when I talk about my own free-floating experience of the client, or free-floating attention to the client. The metaphor I used, I taught a workshop at the Los Angeles County Psychological Association on what I was then calling intuition. But as I said, I don't believe any longer it merits being called intuition. It merits being called attunement. So it's as if I am a television producer Here I am in the control room. The main thing I'm looking at is that screen in the center. I'm focused on the client's presence. I'm looking the client in the face. I'm listening to the client's words. My main object of attention is what the client is generating in my presence. But there are at least five subsidiary screens that are beginning to flash also and to resonate with what's happening in the central screen. The top one right above is memories of the client. Clients talking about things that are happening in the moment. And so one of the kinds of things that can show up is memories of the client talking about other things, or memories of the client talking about this client on other occasions, and maybe talking about it in slightly different ways. So my whole history with a client is there, pieces of which may start resonating inside of me as I'm going with what the flow is in the moment. To a little bit to the upper right, one's own feelings. I am having twistings and turnings of my feelings. Sometimes I'm peaceful, sometimes I'm experiencing sadness, sometimes I experience worry, whatever it is. I have my own affects that are streaming in me while I'm subjecting myself to my flow with the client. To the lower right, yes, I'm daydreaming about possible things I might say to the client. They come up in me. Maybe I should stop and say, "Meh." I don't necessarily translate them into action. They're just beginning to occur to me in response to what the client is doing. I'm beginning to consider some things that I'm going to do next. Uh, where is that coming from? And to the lower left, mentoring sources. I am also visiting what I'm calling mentoring sources there. Books I may have read, movies I may have seen, uh, classes I may have taken, comments from teachers I had. I have taken in information about people in one way or another. Experiences with other people that I've had. These are all mentoring sources that are teaching me something about the challenges I'm confronting with this particular client. And that's helping what's going on in the lower right screen. I'm beginning to formulate possible responses to what I'm hearing. And finally and powerfully, I have my own memories. My client's tale about his or her life as it's unfolding now in the present moment, it's sending me on a variety of memory journeys. Some of the memories don't seem connected at all to what I'm listening to, but I don't believe that anymore. I think there's something I need to understand about a memory I'm visiting because it has some relevance to the client's presence that's being presented to me. So, what's wonderful and rich, all this is happening. All this is happening partly or mostly in my awareness. Each of those screens interrupts the other for a few seconds here and there. And some of it's going on outside of my awareness. It's formulating itself in what Freud would call the preconscious and then appearing on one another or another of the screens. And what I'm commending to my colleagues is please don't go into the session with a treatment plan. Don't go figuring out what it is you're supposed to do at the next section and then try to implement that. Open yourself to this process. Ride the currents that are going to rise in you as you accompany the client wherever the client is leading you. Let the client lead and you follow, and you will find the richest array of possible things that you might respond to what you're hearing with. Trust trust yourself to give birth to what you need to give birth to. You don't have to plan it in advance. As a matter of fact, if you climb up out of your own stream of experiencing and start saying, I better figure out what to do about this, you've abandoned the client and you've given up faith in the process. So stay in the process until you're ready to say something or do something. You will arrive at that point of readiness. You don't have to force it and you don't have to plan it. All right, let me stop this screen sharing. If I could get listened to, and if any of you are willing to follow me, what you will come up with in that screen about possible things you might do, you'll come up with a whole array of things you've never been taught to do. You'll come up with novel things. You'll come up with silly things. You'll come up with teasing things. You'll come up with such an array of rich possibilities of actions you can take in response to the client's thoughts, feelings, and presentations to you. You yourself will become a pioneer. If you have the courage, you'll try things you were never taught to do. You'll try things that may even frighten you because, my God, will this one get me in trouble? Where is this taking me? You don't know whether to trust yourself, reject, clamp down on what you're doing. You're in a wonderfully ambiguous space. But I believe you're not evil. I don't believe that the chances of you getting into trouble, if you'll be whimsical in this way and just surrender to yourself as you surrender to the flow of the client, that this is necessarily going to lead to destructive matters. And you have to stick to empirically validated treatments that have been tested in the crucible of controlled studies. And those are the only kinds of ways you should relate to the client. I don't believe in that mythology, and I've thrown it away years ago and taken the consequences of it. So let me find something else to share with you. Okay, share. Let me close this. Let me move this. Ah, yes, it's there. Here we go. What I'm suggesting is I'm going to go over what I call the sacred myths of professional psychology. And you'll notice the following list is not exhaustive. These are things that we teach graduate students, and we have all been taught are how to understand what we're there for in the consulting room and what we're supposed to be doing. And I have thrown away every one of these things. I no longer believe in any of them. And I'm going to go through them one at a time. How many do I have here? Let me just go ahead. Oh, I have 25 of them already. I did this as an exercise. I'm sure I could come up with some more right now. The first one is the simplest one. We do psychotherapy with our patients. Well, that's what we call, that's the label we give to the activity we're engaged in. But it's highly medicalized, the whole thing. We are treating our patients somehow. Psychotherapy, if you want to translate from the Latin, is healing of the soul. We are supposed to be healers, and we're healing the soul. And I don't believe at all that's what we're doing with our patients. We are really moving freely through a variety of different kinds of interactions. Sometimes we're wise tribal elders. We have something to teach. We're really teaching something about life. Sometimes we're like concerned parents. We're dispensing kindness, and we're trying to repair ruptures in bad parenting by providing good parenting in the consulting session. Sometimes we're dispensing kindness. Sometimes we're dispensing compassion. Sometimes we're running the risk of having a confrontation about bad behavior and trying to interact in a different way. Sometimes we are, what's the phrase I want to use? We are what's called in systems theory jamming the client's game. They're engaged in a self-defeating loop of behavior that goes round and round and on and on. And we have to find some way to jam it. We have to do something that the Zen masters would call issue a Zen koan. Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Which is just stops. It stops them in their tracks. It's so far off of what they're used to doing or hearing back in return that they can't keep doing that endless loop of self-defeating behavior, at least for a second while we startle them. So there are a variety of different things we're doing. To label them as psychotherapy is, I think, is a mistake. I don't do psychotherapy. I am richly variegated. I could move freely into a variety of different kind of interactions and different kinds of positions with the people who show up in my office. And they are not patients. They are human beings. I'm not curing patients or treating patients. Second, psychotherapy is directed to alleviating nervous and mental disorders. Well, I think I've spoken on previous occasions how much I hate this way of thinking about what our task is. And people are suffering from nervous and mental disorders, usually caused by improper neuronal functioning, and therefore they're behaving poorly. And we have to intervene and do something to alleviate their nervous and mental disorders. I don't think that's a useful way to think about the challenge that people are bringing into our offices. The challenge is they are failing to live effectively uh, in certain ways, and we have to help them to understand what is the real challenge they're confronting and what it is they need to change doing in order to transcend the poor way they're living at the present moment. Oh, a little aside, I feel quite delighted by something. The leadership of the APA Division of Independent Practice finally did something useful. It decided that we need some better way to market who we are and what we do. And they came up with a marketing slogan and strategy that they're going to start trying to implement wherever they can get public service space or ad space. The sentiment is as follows: if you're feeling terrible and your life is not working and want to feel better soon, go get a prescription for a psychoactive medication. If you want to change your life so you never have to feel bad in that way again, see a psychologist. I love it. It really treats what's real. The psychoactive medications take the edge off the consequences of bad living. And if you come and see a therapist, what we call a therapist, it really is a wise psychologist over a period of time, you learn to manage your life differently and better. And those states that you were calming with the psychoactive medication start to mute and go away, and you don't need the medication anymore. The third myth is mental health care we do is a branch of general health care. We belong in the House of Medicine. That is the official position of the American Psychological Association. The practicing psychologist should work in group practices with physicians. I don't know why we should work with physicians any more than wills and trust attorneys or financial advisors or dentists or any other kinds of people. All of them have important functions to play in our clients' lives. All of them can be useful to us, the services of all of them. I don't believe I want to be in the House of Medicine. We will always be second class citizens in the House of Medicine, as every ancillary profession is. And we are a freestanding profession with a noble mission of our own. We do not belong in the House of Medicine, as far as I'm concerned. The next myth: we see a client, we make a diagnosis, and then plan interventions that flow from it. I believe that the great majority of my colleagues actually try to do this. It is a hideously failed mission. It is not the way to behave. It's not useful in the consulting room. It's only useful for filling out an insurance claim form. That's the only reason the diagnoses are useful. Uh, the correct diagnosis we need to make is the diagnosis of listening and allowing ourselves to be affected by what we're listening to. That's how we assess what the client is and what the client needs. And what the client needs, if we'll let the client lead in that way and affect us, is something we'll give birth to. It may be something novel we've never thought of before. May not be anything in a textbook or in a workshop we took. And we need to trust ourselves. We are the instruments through which change happens. And sometimes it's not the ordinary way that change happens at all. As a matter of fact, many clients show up, they've done all the things that they're supposed to do. They've gone to this kind of workshop, or they read that kind of book, or they tried EMDR, or they went off to rehab, or they went to an eating disorders clinic, or they did this, that, and the other thing, which represents the great wisdom in the society, and nothing has really helped them. Nothing has made a difference. For God's sake, sometimes people need something that's never been tried before, and be prepared to become aware of something that's never been tried before and try it. And I have a whole bunch of cases that I'm going to present when I get through this section about times I've tried something that, to the best of my knowledge, has never been tried before. Here we go again. The affective and behavioral aspects of the disorders we treat are rooted in biological functioning and possible malfunctioning. Biology drives everything. The synapses are not working properly. The hormones are not working properly. That's why people are exhibiting troublesome behavior. Nobody who is in public policy positions or in the helping professions would deviate from this model. And public policy people who shape delivery systems of services of one kind or another believe in this model, that biology is preeminent. Nobody except some philosophers understand that the mind body problem is simply that. It's not even an interactive problem, it's simply the same phenomenon. Bad living will show up in terms of distressed physiological functioning, and physiological misfunctioning will also appear as bad or altered behavior. They are one and the same thing, just looked at two different levels of analysis. We can, uh, our client's behavior requires being looked at multiple levels of interaction. We need to look at dysfunctional family functioning. That's another system that leads to individual life not functioning properly, and also biology being thrown off. The stress raises blood pressure, it interferes with the immune system, it changes the secretion of certain hormones when we're living badly. We can rise up in a level above that. The economy has great effect on how people live and what happens. Suicide rates go up when inflation rates go up. When unemployment goes up, family violence goes up. A lot of what we're reverberating to is not rooted even in the family. It's rooted in the general culture. So our clients are reverberating to systemic problems that can be analyzed on many different levels. And we, as people trying to help, should have some understanding of where those stressors are and what can be done about them for our clients to take hold of them. 6, psychoses and some other serious adaptive difficulties are clearly biologically based and probably cannot be cured, but at least will have to be managed over the lifespan of the sufferer. Uh, Once again, we're saying very deviant behavior is obviously absolutely rooted in biology. We get concerned that this could be passed on by heredity, there's a strong hereditary component, and on and on and on. Actually, the problem is that we don't know that much about what to do with people who are very badly damaged and how to help them. It's a comfort to just curse at their genes or curse at some part of their neurological system, that the real defect is there. So when we fail, because we're still stupid about how to manage the problem, we don't have to blame ourselves or feel terrible about our own failures. The most important thing I ever heard about this topic, well, I'll take that back. I have heard many important things about this topic. I'm very touched by R.D. Laing's attempt to do something different with psychotic patients. and setting up a place where they could just a real sanitarium, a place where they could come and live, and it would be a sanctuary for them. They could be left alone. They could have somebody to talk to if they wanted to. They could eat their meals in their own place. Interesting lectures were brought in. Communal meals were available. It was just a nice place to live and a kind place to live, and nothing was required of them. A therapist was there if they wanted to talk. The therapist never pulled at them to ask them to or require that they talk. The psychiatrist was there if they wanted to sample medications. They were never forced or compelled to be on medications. And a family, an artificial family, was created to pay attention to them. Everybody was taught to feel responsible for everybody else, to help out if somebody was getting agitated or out of control. The other clients who were living there could come and help too. Everybody could help everybody else. He even brought his girlfriend in, and they lived in, and they had children, and the children were raised in this environment. It was quite a touching and important experiment in dealing with the badly damaged members of our society, the badly deviant members of our society, in a kinder and more accepted way, and without treating them as specimens that something needed to be done to. I also know some long-term research that was done in a county of England. England, of course, has a national healthcare plan, and anybody gets free services. So a large number of people who got labeled as psychotic came to the attention of the public health service. Excuse me, non-alcoholic beer. Uh, and they had a record of what happened to them. Many of them tried the various treatments that were recommended. Some of them were sent to hospitals. Some of them were put on antipsychotic medications. Some of them were treated on an outpatient basis. The records were there of what happened. A large number of them showed up for one visit, was told what they should do for follow up and what was recommended for their care, and they did not participate. They just left, and nobody followed up with them. So they took the researchers took an arbitrary year off the calendar. They looked at all the diagnostic labels, all the people in the county who showed up and been given a diagnosis of psychosis of one sort or another. And then they tried to trace where they were 20 years later. They knew who had been treated and what treatments had been given over what period of time, and they knew the people who had disappeared. And the prediction, of course, is the disappeared people would have gotten worse and worse, and maybe we're really in dire straits right now. And much to their surprise, they found out that of the people who had to be traced down, they found about 80% of them. In that 80%, 40% of them seemed to have deteriorated, but 40% of them seemed to have healed in some way. They were no longer acting bizarrely, and they had taken up their place in society again. And they raise the possibility, wonder of wonders, that sometimes if people are just left alone, there are some kind of self-healing processes that will unfold, and that many of the things we do that we think are helpful, as R.D. Laing would say, really frees the people into an identity of being a terrible deviant and a badly crippled person. That becomes their lifelong identity, and it's very hard for them to move freely out of that identity evermore. They're terrified to give it up too. They know what is expected of them and how to sustain themselves as a psychotic person, and they're scared to stop taking their medications or to try and love somebody, to try and do something novel or different. And we freeze them into the terribleness of their life by the very things we do to treat them. So I'm not willing to endorse number six at all. I don't believe people need to be managed over their lifespan necessarily. Sometimes in the healing outpatient office of one of us, something can happen. And I gave you an example. I did a Hopi chanting service, and I pulled somebody out of a paranoid schizophrenic existence and seemed to have changed her life forever, at least as I can tell 15 years later. And that was done without any medication or any diagnosis whatsoever, certainly without any reference to her biology. 7, we must always evaluate whether a referral for some medication is indicated for the condition we are treating. Uh, I feel sorry for my colleagues. They are so frightened. They're frightened of malpractice suits. They're frightened they're going to fail. They're frightened that unless a psychiatrist is involved, they will be in trouble for not following the standard of care in our profession. So almost routinely, if anything feels complex or complicated, they will make a referral to a psychiatrist. And they run the risk of doing what's in six. They run the risk of what Lang worried about. They run the risk of helping the people to adopt the identity of being a very damaged person and of being dependent on medications to transcend whatever the difficulties are. Uh, I don't mind sending somebody for a consultation. I don't recommend it quickly. If it's brought up by the client, I'll follow. If I'm asked, do I think this might matter? I say, well, you can try. There are many things you can try. You can try psychedelics, you can try herbs. There are a whole variety of things you might try. You are suffering. If you want to reduce your suffering, be experimental. Go try. But the best thing that you can do in order to make sure that you get a grip on what's happening is to learn to manage it, to learn to build your life differently. I can tell you what I think are the building blocks that are missing. Here's how I would think about what you need to do. You have nothing, no purpose or meaning in your life. I want to help you find something that feels worthwhile to you. You're not doing anything worthwhile with yourself. I'd like to work on that. I have a feeling if you could lose yourself in something that felt mildly worthwhile, a lot of your distress would go away. You wouldn't need any herbs or medications or whatever. So go ahead. If it's unbearable and you really need to alleviate this some, I have no objection to that whatsoever. But don't believe that you're really paying attention to solving the problem if you do that. You're only making the pharmaceutical company and the psychiatrist happy because you can become a lifelong consumer of what's being dispensed to you. God, I'm a rebel. 8, we must constantly monitor our efforts to ensure that we are doing falls within the standard of care. Yes, we must always be preoccupied with what is the great mass of my colleagues doing? How would they think about this problem? What kind of diagnosis would they assign to this? And what kind of interventions would they try to give to this client? I have to do what other people are doing. Well, unfortunately, all of us fail a certain portion of the time. And unfortunately, there are a lot of things that show up in the office that are quite difficult to work with and don't have a good prognosis. And if we just keep doing what everybody else is doing, I don't believe much progress is going to happen in our field. Individual ones of us have to take a chance on doing something that hasn't been tried before we'll progress. I don't believe the academics who are doing the usual kind of programmatic research are creative enough to come up with new ways of doing things. They usually are looking at what psychologists are doing, and then they test what we're doing to see if it makes much more difference than a placebo. Is there anything useful in what's being invented here that works better than a placebo? It is charismatic, strange fellow psychologists who start something, and then eventually academicians may get around to studying it to see if they can demonstrate empirically that there's any useful effect of that. So I'm encouraging all my colleagues to be pioneers, to not wait to be told in the research literature what's okay to do, but to dare to experiment themselves with something they may never have tried before, simply because it's occurred to them with some kinds of insistence and keeps nagging at them while they're in the consulting room, listening to and interacting with a given client. Let us help create the standard of care rather than being the ones that have to bow to the standard of care. I love this one. We must be very careful to keep our own personal reactions to the work we do under careful control. No, it's our personal reactions to what we're living through with the client that provide the richness of how we need to behave. Keeping them under control means ignoring them, squelching them, pushing them to one side, trying not to pay attention to them, trying not to, quote, be driven by them. I'd rather you surrender and be driven by them. I think you'll get to a good outcome better if you're being driven by your own reactions than if you're trying to murder them over and over again as the session unfolds. Well, 10, we should never touch someone with whom we are working. Well, my friend Ofer Zur likes to comment on this. There's no prohibition in our code of ethics about touching. There is a law that we should not get sexually involved and erotically attached to our clients, but touching can be very useful. To go and sit with a client who's sobbing because somebody has just died and put your arm around them is not an evil thing, and it may be exactly what's needed. To shake hands eagerly meeting a new client is not necessarily a terrible thing. There's no magic in avoiding touch. uh, there is, there are even now books and papers appearing under what circumstances, what kinds of touch might be meaningful and facilitate an enhanced relationship between the client and the therapist. But that's not a topic I know much about. I just know that the stupid prohibition against any kind of touch or physical contact is absolutely harmful and an unnecessary constraint. We should avoid entering any real life location or event where someone with whom we are working might be present. This one is impossible for our colleagues who are in small towns. This one's impossible to carry out. You can't prevent walking into a grocery store and seeing a client of yours sitting in the grocery store. You can't prevent going to a PTA meeting if your kid's in the same school that the child of one of your clients is in, and not running into the family of your client. We and I would suggest there are even times where it is therapeutic to show up at somebody's event. If you have somebody who struggled very hard to build an acting career and they've gotten a part in a play and they send you tickets, would you come see my play? I see nothing wrong or horrible about going to watch the client's play. You have a political problem if you think their performance is terrible. I don't know what you're going to say about that. But to show up as a gesture of goodwill, as God, I'm so happy to be here and to see what you've done with yourself, particularly if they've had parents who have been very opposed to what they're doing and absent in their lives, to fill in that gap can be very healing for them. We can be a quasi parent or quasi good friend doing what nobody else has ever done. It's not evil. If you get invited to a wedding, it's okay to go. There's nothing bad or evil in and of itself. One of the things you might have to ask is, how should you introduce yourself? Do they care if you introduce yourself to other people at the event as you're their therapist? Do they want to say you've just known them for a long time or you're a friend of the family? What do they want you to do? But go. It's okay. Nothing terrible. We must never enter into a dual relationship with someone under our care. There are actually the standard that's in our ethical standards now has been softened in a sensible way. We should try not to get into dual relationships that are potentially going to affect our judgment. So I wouldn't suggest you barter your services for the services of a house painter who gets drunk frequently and does messy work, because I don't want you to have to be burdened with being very disappointed in the paint job that was put on your place. But I accepted, as I told you in one of my stories, I accepted some meals from a client who wanted to cook for me because she didn't want to be treated as a charity case, and who brought me pine cones in treatment. So I was in a dual relationship. I was somebody she was feeding, and I was somebody she was doing some practical benefit to, rather than just her therapist with an antiseptic relationship with her. And I don't think that's evil, and I don't think that necessarily leads to anything bad, and has the potential to lead to something good. If we think of some possible suggestion, oh, wait, I'm skipping over one. 13, wherever possible, we should avoid the temptations to engage in any self disclosure. This goes so far as don't put any personal pictures of yourself or your family up in your office. Don't have too many objects that could be identified with a hobby you're pursuing or something like that. Your environment should be as bland and as undistinguishable as possible. And your comments should always be as bland and as undistinguishable as possible. Your internal state should not be visible to the client. This is a psychoanalysis on steroids gone mad. And most of us do not practice in traditional psychoanalytic ways. The humanity of the therapist being able to share an experience and share the humiliation of having gone through something similar with a client, can be quite comforting to a client, can enhance the working alliance, can make the client feel better. Sometimes we teach by stories, and we need to teach by stories of obstacles we come across, and how we manage to find some novel solution to that obstacle that isn't commonly talked about. We need to be mentors. We need to share of our lives and of ourselves with the people who we inherit in our practices. This is absolute prohibition is foolish. Now, if you, how can I put this? The self disclosure should be in the interest of providing some kind of benefit to the client. To be egocentric and just want to talk about yourself or show off how smart you are, how clever you are, that can become dangerous. Your self disclosure for the sake of getting admiration from the client or getting some benefit from the client needs to be put to one side. I'm talking about a kind of selfless self disclosure, or there may be some that benefit both parties. But an egocentric self disclosure, I would say, is potentially toxic. And somehow I'll trust you to know the difference. I'll count on you being self aware enough to know, you know what, I was showing off. I better apologize for that. I don't know if that really had any relevance to what the client was talking about the last 10 minutes. You can catch yourself and you can back away again. But to put an absolute prohibition on yourself is probably counter to being effective in the work I would encourage you to do. 14. This is related to 13. If we think of some possible suggestion we might give to someone under our care, we should not do so unless we can find some empirical support for what we imagine saying or doing. Unless there's something in the literature that reassures us that this is a useful thing to do, we should not do it. I think that's nonsense. Uh, the most meaningful moment I had in my psychoanalysis, and I think I talked about that on a previous occasion, was when my analyst stepped out of the usual role he was following, and he actually gave me some instructions on what route to take to get to his office. I was traveling 55 miles one way for my analytic sessions. He managed to save me 10 minutes on my commute every time I went, and that was very significant. And he caught himself and stopped before he finished, and I got angry with him, and we had a big fight about his not being willing, as he said to me, this wasn't what we were there to talk about. And I argued with him, and he finally told me the rest of what I needed to know. And I felt so grateful that I was important enough to him that he would break the rules to be able to talk to me. And not only that, he broke the rules in a way that was meaningful and gave me something that was useful to me. So, my God, if we ever see something that the client is missing, some way they can proceed to take care of something that had never occurred to them, please tell them about it. You are partly a teacher and you have wisdom to impart to them. So, please teach freely. 15. The gold standard for defining what we should do in the consulting room is the double blind study. It is not. The double blind study is what's used to bring pharmaceuticals to market. It's not the gold standard for everything we do. What is the gold standard for testing whether empirically whether two people should get married or not? What is the gold standard for figuring out what the best choice is that a parent should make if they have a dilemma about what to do with the child's difficulty in mobilizing himself or herself to do homework in a more organized fashion. The most important things that can be done are not studied by double blind studies with placebo effects being included. They're studied by interviewing people, by observing people, by single subject empirical designs. There are a whole variety of empirical strategies for trying to study things scientifically and getting data that can make some sense and help answer questions than double blind studies. I'm not a big fan of double blind studies. I even had a fantasy about the following. I know something about research design. A new antibiotic is being tested by the pharmaceutical company. Uh, they typically will give placebos. They'll give the new drug, and they will then check the power of the drug to kill the what the target infection is against known antibiotics that already exist. And before the new drug can come to market, it needs to do statistically significantly better than any currently available drug. That is the test the pharmaceutical company has to go through. So I want to set up a test of a new antibiotic. Only I would have a three design, three group design: a placebo group, a uh, a second placebo group, and a group that the drug is given to. In the first placebo group, I would just give it. They would the people would know they were not being told whether they're getting a placebo or the drug. The group that was getting the drug would also not know that whether they were getting the placebo or the drug. The third group that I'm creating that doesn't exist right now would have very enthusiastic researchers. The researchers would say, "Oh, I'm so glad you're coming in. The early results of the test of this antibiotic are really overwhelmingly wonderful. Seems to be the most powerful drug for this condition that we have at this moment. I'm glad you've been accepted in the drug trials because this is really going to make a difference for you. And we just need enough subjects to fill out the map of what we need to present to the FDA. But we're sure we have a really powerful winner here." And I predict that the group that's been given the drug with that kind of encouragement will do better than any of the other groups by far. And that the human interaction, the way the scientists act when they're dispensing the medication, is itself a placebo that's very, very powerful, maybe even more powerful than what's being given. So I think whenever we dispense any kind of pharmaceuticals, We should dispense it with cheerfulness and optimism. This is going to take care of your problem. This is the best thing we have to offer you, and it's really strong and potent. And we can even lie. And I bet you the cure rates for diseases will go up if we do that. Human interaction is as powerful, has as powerful an effect on the immune system as the drugs we give have an effect on the immune system. The mind body problem is multiple layers of the same thing. God damn it. I'm preaching to the deaf, but that's okay. I'll keep trying. 17. We must remain objective or we cannot address the challenge of our work effectively. Hell no, I want you to drown in your subjectivity. That's where I want you to live as you're sitting there with your clients. 18. We should turn aside and refuse to answer any curiosity that those we serve might have about who we are, what we believe, and any other related matters. Are you married? Do you have children? Have you ever gotten as depressed as I've gotten? Under no circumstances, turn those aside. Say, what do you think about that? Or why do you ask? Dodge and frustrate the client. That's terrible. Uh, the only questions I don't answer are questions I feel too uncomfortable to answer. I'll answer anything else. And I will say, I don't feel comfortable answering that. That feels somehow rather private to me. It's only my close intimates that I talk about that with. And we don't have that kind of relationship. Maybe we will one day and you could ask me again. I don't know. I just don't feel comfortable answering that yet. I'm sure there are lots of things you haven't had the courage to talk to me about yet. And that's okay. We'll go a step at a time. We'll find out from each other what overlaps and what has to be kept separate. I'm just a fellow human being in the room with them. That's all. 19. We must be very careful not to exploit our clientele. If we are getting too much pleasure out of knowing one or another of them, we are probably using them. It should consider going back into therapy ourselves or at least seeking a consultation. God forbid you should look forward to seeing your clients. God forbid you're learning something from seeing them. No, no, no. Therapy has to be a zero sum game. You exist only for the benefit of your clients, and you have to be like a parent. You have to be self-sacrificing, and other than the fee you pay you, there should be no benefit to you whatsoever. And I don't believe it's a zero-sum game. I believe in cases we are being the most helpful with, I believe we are changing ourselves the most too. We are getting very direct benefit out of the synergy between ourselves and clients we are helping a lot. It's teaching us something. We're changing something. Even if what only we're changing is how we are in the consulting room. That's a wonderful thing to have changed because we've had a successful experience with a client. 20. The most damage of those we see are the most vulnerable. We have to be particularly careful with them because of their fragility. And because we can easily cause them terrible damage, we have to make sure that we are even more cautious, circumspect, and reserved than may be true in our sessions with the more sturdy. Well, that's turned entirely inside out. The most bull in the china shop, like the most dangerous, the most powerful people we see are the most disturbed among us. They're the ones who may assault us. They're the ones who are going to frustrate us. They're the ones who are going to reduce us to impotence over and over again. They're the ones who are going to defeat us over and over again. We don't need to be the most circumspect and cautious with them. We may need to be the most boldest and risk taking with them in order to be of any help to them. And in contrast to their being fragile, they are extremely powerful. They can defeat anyone's attempt to have any impact on them. They have much more power than we do. 21. In all our work, we must remind ourselves of the seriousness of being reported to the Board of Psychology and make doubly sure we do nothing that might trigger such a report. Well, God damn it, we can't control whether we get reported to the Board of Psychology or not. And we can't do anything about the fact that they would probably disagree with many of the principles that I am announcing to you. We must all remember that the Board of Psychology is not there to facilitate our growth and development and to facilitate the work we do. The Board of Psychology is there to protect the welfare of clients and to make sure, as to the maximum extent possible, that we do no harm to clients. So if we do anything controversial, if we do anything that might upset our client, we run the risk, of course, that the client will be disturbed and will take out the disturbance making a report. We, if you're going to deviate from what's ordinary, at least write a lot of notes about that particular deviation from what's ordinary, and come up with some good sounding rationale for why you're doing it. Try and protect yourself, but do not, by all means, allow yourself to be suffocated in anything ingenious, creative, or kind because you think the board would not react well to it. We don't work for the Board of Psychology, no more than we work for insurance companies. We work for our clients and we serve them to the best of our ability. I'll say the same thing about on 22 about finding ourselves the recipient of a malpractice lawsuit. We don't work for our malpractice insurance carriers either. Please be willing to run some risks. Every profession has risks. 23. As we evolve in our work, it is incumbent upon us to develop a few specialty niches and become deeply immersed in and masterful at one or another of the theoretical orientations that seem to have coalesced around a particular kind of a challenge, e.g., DBT for borderline personality disorders or EMDR for post traumatic conditions, and so forth. This is a good way to limit your practice. This is a good way to make sure you're going to refer out and turn away a large number of people that are seeking your services. This is a good way that you're going to become more mechanical yourself, seeing the same thing, diagnosing the same thing, and doing the same thing over and over again. One of the best ways to be vital is treat the consulting room as it's a forum for having a magical adventure, and treat anybody who shows up as if they're bringing you what might be a new message. Stay open to a wide variety of clients of a wide variety of ages and with a wide variety of potential challenges they're asking for your comment on. Stick around, learn something from each one of them, and become more and more knowledgeable about the array of human dilemmas and not about some niche that's going to give you burnout after you've been doing it for 20 or 30 years. 24. The ending of our work with a particular consumer of our services is best carried out if there is some set of sessions devoted to bringing some kind of closure to the work we have been doing together. I don't know where this myth came from. Somehow, if a client just ceases to show up, we're supposed to chase them and get them to come in and talk about why they're not coming, or maybe even pressure them to continue. There's no correct way to end the contact with us. Some people need to flee. They just want to flee and be left alone. Some people want to talk about it endlessly before they do it. Some people want to understand why they're impelled to want to leave at a particular time, and are they hiding for something? Let the client lead and you follow. There's not one size fits all. Let the ending happen because the client wants to end it, and let the ending not take place to satisfy you or be in a fashion that you think is the correct fashion for endings to happen. There is no one way that endings should happen. 25. It is best and most prudent to avoid, quote, mixing up, close quote, our care of an individual or individuals by cycling between individual sessions, possible couple sessions, and possible family sessions. No, I set myself free of this one many years ago. If something is happening with someone and I think it might be useful to have a child there, a spouse there, a coworker there, anybody, somebody else with whom some turbulence is happening, I feel very free to suggest it might be useful to bring the other person in instead of just fulminating about what's hurting with that person without looking at the fullness of what they're experiencing, of trying to find a solution that involves their cooperation and participation too. One person acting alone often cannot solve a variety of dilemmas. It requires the help and actions of other human beings too. So I can move freely between dyads in the office, single people in the office, entire families in the office, or strange collections of people in the office, all working on a common theme, like in group therapy. Any combination of people in the office is useful depending on what needs to happen at a given moment and what needs to be taken care of. Don't get, I am going to see you twice a week on Mondays at 3 o'clock, and we're going to do that rigidly all the time, and there'll be no deviation from that. Okay, I think I've exhausted this document. So I am going to stop. I'm going to stop the sharing of this, and I'm going to stop my lecture, and I'm going to put this open to anybody between my two listeners who has anything they want to talk about.
Well, first off, Arthur,
The floor is open.
I appreciate the concept of attunement. And I guess when I'm thinking about kind of like how does one gauge when one is attuned, whether a response to that is going to be helpful or not. And I guess kind of like from what we're saying, or what you're saying, and what I probably do as well, is that you're betting on that what you say will in fact will be helpful and to the client. And
Yeah,
so
more often than not, or
yeah,
or at least it, if it isn't helpful, it won't be harmful. You can
yes.
say, "Oh, I thought that might help, but I see that's probably meaningless for you. So I'm sorry I interrupted you." No damage is going to happen.
Mhm.
Thank you
Yeah, it
for helping
seems.
with that clarification.
I mean, it seems like all 25 of these points are, in essence, an attempt to protect the attunement.
Yes.
Um, yeah, or allow it even to happen.
Yeah. If you're mechanically carrying out a set of interventions you're supposed to use for this condition you've diagnosed, there isn't much attunement going on. You're
Hmm.
doing what you've been taught to do. You have a specimen here and you're working with the specimen.
Yeah.
Your story about your analyst was particularly interesting to me. When I was in my graduate school for several years, I was in 4 times a week analysis
Me too.
with an analyst in training,
Yes, me
and
too.
he was a faculty member at UCLA and going back, and very experienced, and that was a very meaningful experience. It was like 7 o'clock in the morning. Nobody but my analysts and I were together for that hour in the entire
Yep.
block in Westwood, and it was meaningful. That evolved into seeing him periodically, 1 time a week here or there, as I matriculated, and then he had a terminal cancer,
Oh, gee.
and he knew he was dying, and he invited me to lunch with him, and that was a very kind of meaningful lunch. And then he invited me. I think I picked him up at his condo, and then we drove to lunch, and I drove him back, and he had me come up to his apartment and choose a book from his bookshelf. And he then took the book and he signed it, and he also imparted a few words in the book. And I think that was very meaningful to me.
I am sure the two memories you're giving me now about meeting him for that lunch and going to his apartment for that book are probably the most profound and important things that happened during your whole relationship with him.
Absolutely.
What do you remember about any comments he made when he was being the analyst in the analytic session? Did any of them stay with you? Did any of them
Sure,
seem to make any difference?
he was kindly and supportive, but you know, kind of like somewhat withholding. You know, occasionally he would sort of come out of his shell and would be you know, very interactive. But you know, for the most part, he remained in the background and you know, behind the couch. But then as kind of like our relationship evolved, he was kind of like more present and more available. And then, you know, basically you know, he allowed
He
me.
allowed himself to surrender to the attunement with you rather than carry out his role as analyst.
Yeah.
My analyst never did. He,
Hmm.
he would say, "Come on in, and it's time to stop." And then every once in a while, he would dose me with some little interpretation, and I would die to hear any words. But I'm telling you, none of his interpretation stayed with me. Only those moments remained with me.
I think as our relationship evolved, he was able to kind of like show how much he cared about me.
Yes. And I believe that, by the way, for better or worse. I think my analyst really liked me, but he couldn't say anything about that or act as if he did. He
Mhm.
had to be cold and aloof and cautious.
Terrible.
All right, I hear silence in the background. I think I will go for a walk with my wife now, and I will be back next week. And I have another document. It's more stories of unusual things I have done with people. I gave the clamored in me insistently, and I tried to follow and ride the current that was coming to me. All right. Have a
Very
good
good.
weekend, guys.
You too.
We'll see you.
Bye.
All
Bye.
right. Be well.